And that can be kind of despairing and lead you down the road towards like a nihilism.
Yeah, you're just running around like a chicken with your head cut off.
That can be effective too if you're trying to scare people. See that nothingness and actually see it as a radical opportunity.
Hello. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we are finally going to wrap up our book club. This is actually the pace at which, though, I think people should read this book.
Oh,
you know?
Yeah. It's only been 5 episodes, man. That's not that much.
No, it's not even that. It's just more letting the ideas percolate in between the episodes, too. That's, I think, been super beneficial for me. You know?
Yeah, doing it every other week, pretty much like this, has been very helpful to let things kind of settle into the subconscious before bringing them back up again. There's no way you could have read multiple chapters at once. It would have been mind-numbing.
Yeah, I mean, some books you can fly through in a couple of days. Yeah, you would. Not only would it be mind-numbing, but I think you'd miss so much about the sort of applicability of the things that this book offers, you know? Just by letting it sit and make connections with other things that you're thinking through or other conversations you have or shit that you hear on the news. I don't know. But it's the Sergei Prozorov book, Ontology and World Politics, Void Universalism 1, which means there is a Void Universalism 2. I don't know if, when, or what, if we're going to get into that second book at some point, but we're going to wrap that up today. Also, a reminder, the Patreon account is up. You can go over there and subscribe to our $5 tier to get an access to bonus episodes as well as the monthly newsletter. Troy and I just had a little meeting. We figured out what we're going to do with the newsletter. It's going to be funky and cool. It's going to have some recommendations. It's going to have some shitty stuff. It's going to have some articles. It's going to have some stuff on what we're reading.
Yes, we're literally sending you a newsletter with shitty stuff in it because that's our brand.
And recommendations, you know. I mean, the yin and the yang here, dude. So, yeah, you can get that for $5 a month. And then, of course, there's the option to be involved in suggesting future episodes as well. So go over to patreon.com and get information regarding to that.
But before we do that, we got one thing we got to do.
What's that?
One of us has to actually do the titular shitty minute. That's when one of us talks about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week. And Austin, it's up to you.
Dude, do you watch Black Mirror, right?
I did, yeah.
Did you see the new season?
I did.
Did you see episode 1 with Bryce Dallas Howard?
Which one was that again? Remind me.
Where everyone's swiping and rating and you have like this social rating system based on every interaction that you have.
That wasn't the most recent season. That was 2 seasons ago, I think.
There's a newer one than that?
Have you seen the Star Trek one?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Season. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Okay. So the season before the last. That's right. I forgot that there was a new season. I kind of thought they all combined in my brain. Okay, yeah, that one. 2 seasons ago. You remember that episode, right?
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago in pop culture is like basically prehistoric, but I vaguely remember it.
You just remember the general conceit of the episode, which is what matters. Well, you know that shit's coming to reality in China by the year 2020.
I did hear about that, yeah.
It's called the social credit system or the social rating system. And basically, every citizen is going to be given a rating system that is derived from various bits of information, but that gives you let's say, a social credit score. And this social credit score will determine whether or not you can take public transportation, where you can sit in public transportation, whether or not you can go into certain coffee shops, whether or not you can get a house loan, what kind of house loan you can get, how much of a house loan you can get. And the way they're going to analyze the data in order to come up with your social credit system is looking through your social media activity, looking at your work history, all kinds of different things in order to, and then it's not just like your financial credit scores. Well, but that's going to go in there too, and they're going to give you this score. And that's fucking weird, man. That's fucking weird and terrifying, and it just makes me think that Charlie Brooker is like some sort of soothsaying psychic. And it makes me think that there's other shit going on that we should look at Black Mirror about, and it's freaking me out.
Well, don't you think that more information is always better for making decisions in a free market?
Well, I mean, supposedly, according to the efficient market hypothesis, you got to have more information, man, more data, less
Yes.
privacy, more transparency. Get in there, know
So,
us better.
so here's my question, Duder. Obviously, the dystopian part of it that people freak out about is the idea of the government sort of regulating what you can and can't do based upon
Right.
this credit score, right? But is it actually any less dystopian if that exact same thing exists and it's just as ubiquitous, but the government doesn't oversee it?
Well,
Because
that's yeah,
to me, it's like that doesn't make a difference at all. It's just as terrible if it's
yeah,
that ubiquitous, whether or not the government's involved. Because you could still have, market operators and actors restricting your ability to do certain things and to sit in certain coffee shops or whatever, right?
right.
So, like to me, whether the government's involved or not, and I think in the Black Mirror episode, isn't it just like a Facebook gone universal rather than the government being involved? I don't really remember.
Yeah, basically, that's what it is. I mean, from what I remember, there's no explicit mention even of the government controls. It is just a form of like social media, social control.
Because the one older lady opted out, and you can opt out if you want, but you just can't really like
Can't
you're
function. You're a pariah, a social
socially.
pariah.
Yeah, socially you can't function, but I think legally you're fine. Like you can
Yeah, exactly. Well,
live
yeah,
and
because she had a credit score or she had a rating. It was just like fucking 1.3 or whatever, which means that she can't rent a car and she can't get a house loan, and people look at her like she's some sort of outcast, like she's the ugly other, you know? So, just like people do though when they look at someone who's homeless on the street today, just like people do when it's an immigrant or a refugee that they don't want coming into their country. It's it's kind of just a digitized version of ideological biases that we already carry with us, which is the interesting thing. I think that would be the Lacanian Zizekian reading, right? He would say that this isn't actually some sort of novelty. This is really just the augmented reality version of what we already do at the level of ideology.
yeah, it's just making explicit what's already implicit.
Yeah,
Like, yeah,
exactly.
you were talking about the ideological biases, implicit biases we all have, right? It reminds me of that great line from Atlanta when Paperboy says, "Man, I scare people at ATMs. What am I supposed to do?" And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, if people just are implicitly biased against you, there's not much you can do about that.
Right. This is just a way to codify it in digital form so that you're carrying it around with you at all times. I mean, it the reason that I think it's scary is that it is just like holy fuck, Black Mirror, dystopian futures coming to reality. But the thing is I read this really interesting article from the New Economics Foundation that I shared on my Twitter, and it's one of the political economists there, the researchers there, and he's talking about yeah, that's terrifying, but let's look at our own societies here in the West where we're implementing similar stuff based on the apps and big data analytics that are governing our lives. We may not have a social credit rating right now per se, with scores that are kind of like popping up over our heads with every social interaction or every business transaction. But in a way, we kind of do. We already have credit scores, right? We have social media data and signifiers. So, how many followers do you have? Do you have a blue check next to your name or not? How many Instagram followers do you have? What's your output on these sites? How many YouTube followers do you have? Things like that that do sort of give you a certain amount of social capital that people automatically judge you based on. And then, of course, beyond that, there are other apps like Uber and fucking Deliveroo and Uber Eats and Lyft and all these things where you are rating people based on these basic acts of exchange that we engage in. And now at one level, I get it. For efficiency purposes, it's kind of nice. You're like, hey, this person isn't an asshole in their offering of this service. And so it is supposed to weed out the bad eggs and, the cream of the crop will rise to the surface sort of thing. But at the same time, there are some problems with it and there are some things to kind of think through that are pretty fucking scary, man, and that kind of make us think about how it is that we mediate our social relations.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the change in the labor market, right? Going from people working for larger firms which can guarantee them some security and stability to being independent contractors whose brand is their themselves, right?
Mm,
It's a big difference when you work for a company that has 4.5 Yelp stars and so people want to go to your restaurant because the food's good and the service is good. Compared to,
Mm.
I have 4.5 stars in Uber, I'm like close to getting fired
Mm.
because I'm not close enough to 4.9 or whatever, and so I basically have to like spend all of my money to put candy bars and free water bottles and stuff in the backseat of my car.
Yeah, and I you have to do the performance with the smile and stuff like that, which is easy for somebody like me who's just a fucking, I am a performer anyway. So like I love the performance industries, right? So being a waiter for me, some people that fucking terrifies them. I'm like, I love it. I get to talk to strangers all the time and get to know people and get to
Didn't you read
smile
enough
and it's
Sart, man? Hell with other people. Did you not
I
actually like
see.
internalize this stuff?
Nah, I think he wasn't saying that really, man. He had something else that he was getting to. Um, but yeah, so for me the kind of Uber rating system isn't as terrifying, but I think that it is problematic for all the reasons you're saying. I mean, it's basically turning us into in a lot of ways to like a performance society where every interaction is a performance so that we don't offend somebody, so that we don't threaten our potential rating, you know? And in a way, human societies function that way. In a way, right? This is again, this is kind of making explicit or codifying or intensifying certain tendencies that we already have in social relations. Because whenever we interact with somebody, we have an idea about them, and then we tell our friend, God, that person's an asshole. And then boom, that person has been given a social rating, at least in your little community. But this is like that writ large with no possibility of forgiveness and forgetfulness because it's it's uh it's like solidified into a storehouse of memory that becomes your currency. And that's the problem is there's no element of forgiveness that's allowed in these what Bernard Stiegler calls mnemotechnical devices, as in sort of like these epistemic devices that retain our memories within them and then constantly remind us of who we are and how you're supposed to be and shit like that. There's no jubilees here.
Yeah, I mean the two things that cause sort of social epidemics of depression and dysphoria and stuff, right, are like social isolation, right, and sort of material tragedy. And
Mm,
when you don't have the safety net underneath you and you can be restricted from having a home or a car or whatever else, if you lose your job, you can't get sick or you risk losing all your savings. You get rid of that, that material safety net, and also the social safety net in the sense of like, you know,
mm.
if everyone has a certain score for you and doesn't have any opportunity for forgiveness or forgetfulness or grace or mercy or anything, then once you wrong people, then you're fucked. Like you're going to be isolated forever.
Exactly.
Like that other Black Mirror episode where you can choose people who have committed crimes to be blacked out from your view. The one that John Hamm
Oh,
was in.
right. Yeah,
That was the
yeah.
scariest one I think I've ever seen. Because
Mm.
basically everyone you look at has blacked you out, and so you're completely isolated forever. Like you're never going to get a chance to redeem yourself or to enter society again.
Yeah, that's fucking terrifying. Makes me think of Fight Club, where it's like you got to just destroy the system, destroy the credit system altogether, man. Jubilees, brother, jubilee.
That would be great. The Fight Club 2, they destroy the internet.
Yeah.
That actually sounds like an
Uh,
Always Sunny episode, but maybe a crossover.
the gang destroys the internet.
The gang goes Fight Club all over the internet's ass.
All right, cool. So now we are going to delve into the final section of our book club on Sergei Prozorov's Ontology and World Politics, Void Universalism 1. It has been a long haul, but we are finally there. We've talked about the world as being nothing. We've talked about nihilism. We've talked about what politics could potentially mean based on the idea that the world is nothing. And this week, finally, he's going to talk about things that people are familiar with. Terms like libertarianism and egalitarianism and communitarianism. And he's going to talk about like the failures of certain phases within the Soviet Union and within Western democracies and all kinds of things. It's much more practical, but it's still pretty fucking dense. So we're
Yeah,
going to take our time.
yeah, he talks about all those terms, right? But they don't mean what you think they mean. He explicitly says, "Yeah, but this doesn't really mean anything."
This is like Inigo Montoya. You keep using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it means.
Yeah, exactly. Inconceivable. Um,
Inconceivable.
so yeah, we should say those we recapped last time we did the book club. The three axioms of the void of the capital W world are equality, freedom, and community. And you can go back to the last episode if you want to see how Prozorov thinks that we can derive, in a sort of logical sense, those three axioms from the fact that the world is essentially nothing. I think we talked about last time. It's a pretty similar idea to the notion of the contingency um, of all aspects of being in the world, right? Every
Mm,
being, and not just every person, but every being, every literal existent thing, is free in the sense that it can be otherwise than it is. So it's contingent the way that it currently is. All beings are equal in the sense that none is sort of higher up in a hierarchy than any other. We're all equal in the sense of being nothing or being everything being contingent. And then also we're in a community together in the sense that we all have this commonality of not having any commonality in a
right.
sense
Yeah. Well, we share what we share in common is our freedom and equality, right?
of nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I will say one thing. This isn't the best spatial metaphor, and metaphors obviously are only valuable insofar as they sort of stimulate your thought or help you to orient yourself to something that might be more difficult or whatever it is that's being compared or discussed. But the way I think about it is that there's almost like two lines, right? One on top of the other. And the top one is the world of experience, the world of the ontic, the world of phenomenological, intra worldly orders. It's the everyday relations that Prozorov is discussing at the political level, at the social level, at the level of the fucking uh, clothes that we wear. All of those things are relations that exist on that top line. The bottom line is the line that's underneath that line. It's the one that's hidden. It's the one that if we're standing on the top line, existing in that world, we can't really see it below. We look down, but we just see the ground. We don't see the line underneath the ground that we're standing on. But that's the level of the world as void. That's the level of ontology proper that he's talking about. So if it helps, I don't know if that helps you, Troy, but for some reason when we're talking about it, I kind of am always just seeing this we talked about it in like I think the second episode, the Urgrund, right? This underneath ground that is sort of always potentially bursting through, but that we're maybe not always aware of. That is the void, the world as nothing, and that's kind of there. And I think that might kind of help people wrap their head around what he's talking about here with how it is in a more concrete sense that the world is void is able to affect politics at the phenomenological level or in the top line. Does that you think that helps at all?
Yeah, I think spatial metaphors really help. And also, I think, again, this idea of using nothingness and negation can be kind of confusing sometimes. I think just referencing the idea of contingency is really helpful to me in the
Okay.
sense that you can look at every positive aspect of the world, whether it's relational or it's one of sort of identity, and you can see how that's a contingent thing, how it doesn't have to be that way. And there's a certain reason why it is that way. That didn't have to be the case. And you can
Right.
do that with anything. I mean, Austin, you're an actor and you are a researcher and you live in Sydney, Australia, right?
Yeah.
None of those things had to be the case. And you can even
Right.
bring that down to the levels which we tend to think aren't contingent, like the fact that you are a human being who has some sort of significance over and above non human things, right? Which is something that's affirmed every single moment of your life when you take other things that exist in the world and you eat them to consume their energy and fuel yourself. It's sort of treating yourself as more important than everything else, right? So we
Mm,
just naturally think that. But in reality, there is no reason to actually think that. We aren't any more important other than the fact that we've decided that we are,
mm,
right? And so you can look at that and that can be kind of despairing and lead you down the road towards like a nihilism of, nothing is ultimately more significant than just the world as it is, as a brute fact, and so nothing matters. But that's kind of the exact opposite of what Prozorov wants to do, right? He wants you to look at the world,
mm.
see that nothingness, and actually see it as a radical opportunity, because then it
Right.
means these three things are derived from that truth, that we have this relational pattern that exists between all things, not just living things, all things, that they are all free, could be different, that they are all equal, and that they are all share that in common or have that commonality.
Right. And that's kind of where he builds, or what he builds off of in this chapter. So it's the fourth chapter, it's the final chapter of the book. It's called The Typology of Political Invariance. Basically, what he's going to look at is what are these non-variant, these consistent political forms or types that we can understand that exist in our actual experience, and how do they relate to these universal axioms of freedom, equality, and community. And so, getting into it, the first thing he says is he says the affirmation of the axioms of freedom, equality, and community universally for the world in question constitutes political practice as the process of the transformation of transcendental orders of particular worlds on the basis of universal principles that are transimmanent in relation to them, as in into the particular worlds. So basically, what he's saying is affirming these axioms, if equality, freedom, or freedom, equality, and community, that is what constitutes political practice. And I think it's so important to recognize at this point that this is not simply a theoretical or academic project. Affirmation doesn't just simply mean, cool, like intellectually, I will say that yes, it is true that freedom, equality, and community are the universal axioms that ground world politics. It's a political practice, because not only are those things, let's say, benchmarks by which we can criticize or judge or interpret contingent political or socio-political orders, but at the same time, they are the very things that constitute. They are the very things that have led to the emergence of all of the existing socio-political orders in history as such.
Yeah, it's a social reality, right? And in fact, he even says, I think, most of the time, this is not conscious, not consciously done by individuals or even by sort of a group consciousness. A lot of times we don't realize this is what we're affirming or negating, but in fact, this is the social reality.
This is the ontological reality. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
the reason that it's the social reality is because you can't escape being, right? You can't escape existence or life as such. Like, this just is the way things are.
Yeah, there's that weird tension though, in that what's the difference between the ontological and sort of the individual persons? Because in the previous chapter we talked about how it's actually all beings, but then every example given in this chapter is about people. But
Right, that's
that
true.
doesn't destroy the argument so much as just say, hey, we're limited here.
Exactly, because that's kind of what he says at the end, right? He's like, what does it even fucking mean to say that, you know, trees are free in the same way to say that Troy is free? We don't really know what that means, but we could definitely, if it is true, we have to at least affirm it and then work towards it and figure that shit out.
And then never talks about it again. But that's okay.
Yeah, I know. I feel like an environmentalist or an ecologist would come along and they'd have something really interesting to add to this, but he does not at the moment. But that's okay. But so the thing is so what that means then is the affirmation of it is a political practice. It doesn't just mean it's some sort of theoretical armchair philosophical thing, but it's actually what you do in this real world in your social, political, economic, communal behaviors. And that all of those things actually relate to all of this abstract theoretical and logical work that he has been doing in the previous work.
Yeah, exactly. And affirmation is only one of the three things you can do with these axioms. Affirmation is
Right.
one, right? Obviously, affirming all three of them would be the ideal type, which I guess we'll get to probably at the end. But the other two things you can do is you can negate any of the three axioms in two different ways. So he says you can negate reactively, and sort of the reactive negation is one where you allow the axiom to work, but not maximally, right? Not sort of in its fullness, and only usually in the service of one of the other axioms. So it's kind of like contingent or non-necessary. It can come and
Mm.
go. It can vary. And then the other one is the obscure negation, which is the term he uses for sort of trying to destroy the axiom entirely because you see it as a threat to the social or political order. So you can affirm, you can reactively negate, or you can obscurely negate, but you have to do one of the three.
Yeah, and the reason that it's important to make that distinction is because for him there's a way to interpret what he calls, liberalism, egalitarianism, and all these other sort of combinations of the minimality or maximality of the recognition or maximization of the political axioms. But there's a way to sort of delineate the, let's say, the healthiness, or to identify the status of how good any of these particular phenomenological political projects are in relation to what would be actual world politics, which is the maximization of all three of them, right? And so you can have the sort of, let's say, a maximal expression of freedom, but a negation of equality and an obscurantism towards community. Well, that leads to a particular actual way that we can understand political movements or political states or political events that have existed in historical time. And and I think there's something really useful in that as a sort of as a measuring stick. Does that make sense? Is a sort of yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as a literal typology, that's really helpful, and I like that part of it. I thought even the best part of it, and the most helpful for me, was not just the typology, but the idea that it was a process. He actually doesn't just give us
Mm,
the typology, meaning like just the sort of the members themselves, the items, as if they're members of a set, but this this sort of this setup here allows us to talk about the change from one to the other, and even the
mm,
minute changes from reactively negating to obscurely negating. Um,
right.
and so that was really helpful for me to think about why. And he even has a parable near the end of the chapter where he talks about how this might go from maximally affirming all three to negating all three. And
Mm,
even kind of, I think his conclusion at the end is if you don't maximize all three, freedom, equality, and community, if you negate one, eventually that leads you to negating all of them over
mm.
time. It's sort of like a dissolution or devolution that inevitably
Yeah.
happens. It reminds me a lot of Plato's five regimes from the Republic. Because like the
It remi-
five regimes, you have like aristocracy, teamocracy, and oligarchy, and democracy and tyranny. But it's not just a typology, right? Plato wants to talk about how it devolves down to tyranny
mm.
eventually as like the worst form.
It reminds me a lot of Sartre in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, who talks about how you have this group infusion that erupts in this expression of radical freedom, equality, and community. And then all of a sudden things start to solidify once the group has achieved their task. The storming of the Bastille is the example that Sartre focuses on. Well, once they've taken the Bastille and they're like, cool, now that we've done this, what the fuck do we do now? Then you all of a sudden start to solidify in your roles. No longer is your radical freedom expressed, but now you have a particular identity. You are now a locksmith, or you are now a musketeer, or whatever the fuck it is that your role is, right? And then that solidifies even further once you get together and you create what Sartre calls the oath or the pledge, which was took place at the tennis court oath, which is where you basically say, okay, we will never go back to the way we were again. Well, now you've solidified your group in its being, which again has created a sense of community, but has it negated equality, or has it sort of solidified or deepened the negation of freedom? And then this sort of goes through these further transformations where that idea of rigidity sets in even further, and then you become an institution eventually. And the institution is the point at which sort of all three are negated, and the only thing that really matters is the logic of the sovereign, which again Sergei Prozorov talks about. So I'm reading this and I'm like, oh fuck, man, he this is like has a lot of crossover resonance with Sartre's project in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. So he doesn't mention him at all, but there's some interesting, at least an understanding of how it is that there are these gradations, these tendencies to slip from the expression of radical freedom, equality, and community, and how they can gradually slip away until they become bureaucratic, institutional, oppressive regimes that negate freedom, that negate equality, and that negate community.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. But given what you've told me about CDR and Sartre's later work, that makes a lot of sense. That wasn't kind of Sartre's animating problem, the fact of sort of Soviet overreach and it's like
In a lot of ways, yeah.
solidification and lack of freedom in the organization, right? And yeah, Prozorov seems to be like a huge point that he makes regularly, and seems to be kind of, I think, the ultimate conclusion of the book is that this is a process that will happen. If you negate any one of the three axioms or more than one, then you will fall down this slope, right?
Right.
But it's not inevitable. You don't have to do it, and you can always go back. You
That's
can
it.
always
Yeah, even
change.
even if you start like you start to like, equality has slipped a little bit, you can always become faithful again to the element that you're kind of negating or neglecting or obscuring, and you can bring it back up again.
Yeah, but if you don't recognize it as that, as such, if you don't think you are negating community or freedom, but you actually are, then you'll just keep falling down the slope and you'll end up negating everything. So I thought that was
Right.
a very helpful way of thinking about these processes, because too often we fall into this binary of any social formation that we put together is inevitably going to end up in this, which is just totally like not even a good faith argument, right? It's just a slippery slope argument. But at the same time, because of initial conditions of certain social formations, they do tend towards certain alterations and changes. So we should admit that too, that there is a tendency to
Mm,
evolve and to change in certain ways that are predictable, but then also it's not inevitable. It's
mm.
a hard middle ground to actually find there.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot too about our discussion that we had with Brett last week with regards to the accelerationist manifesto and, some of the questions that we had about the manifesto, about how to build more vertical long-term strategies and things like that. And I feel like it's almost too bad we didn't read this section before we chatted with Brett, or that we didn't read this section with Brett, because I feel like we would have been able to engage sort of like a compare and contrast between, okay, here's where the Accelerationist Manifesto has some holes, and then here's where Prozorov's project maybe sort of tries to fill in a lot of those gaps and say, well, here's how you can build these long term strategies. They have to be based upon these principles or these axioms, or here's how it is that certain elements of folk politics or of direct action sort of don't fully maximize the idea of politics as such, but they sort of negate other certain elements. And it would have been interesting to kind of work through that and see if we could have fleshed that out a little bit. But yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know.
it does make politics very contextual, right? Even though it has this overarching kind of logical paradigm to it, it means you actually have to look at the current social reality and say, what's actually happening here? Is
Mm,
like in libertarianism, is freedom being affirmed while equality and community are being negated? And in what way are they being negated? The reactive way or the obscure way?
mm,
Because that will then tell you how you can go about trying to fix the problems. You have to know first what the problem is, the current reality is, before you can go ahead and fix it. Kind of like Zizek's classic line, "Don't do, think,"
mm,
which is like the inversion of the stop thinking so much and just act already. We actually
mm.
have to think about what are our actions intending to do, because if they're not sort of pointed at resolving the actual um, problem that exists, then they're not going to be effective.
Yeah, you're just running around like a chicken with your head cut off,
Well,
which
that can be
you
effective too
gotta
if you're trying to scare people.
sometimes. That's good, man. That's the primal scream, right? Ah! I have no head, fuckers.
How can you say
Um,
that if your head's cut off?
what? Listen, motherfucker. This is
Do your
my
vocal cords
fantasy.
make any noise just by vibrating?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Stop trying to put a hole in my ideas. God damn it. Um, so okay. So let's get into kind of this what exactly it is that he's fleshing out. He says that so each of these three axioms may be redefined in generic terms, indiscernible in terms of any particular intra-worldly predicate. And so he says, thus we may conclude that it is impossible to discriminate between the three axioms on the basis of the relation to the transcendental of a particular world. All three axioms may either be subsumed under it or subtracted from it. So what he's going to then develop is these seven political invariants that are combinations of the three political axioms that he sees as being typologies of politics. So do you think that's the best way to do it? Just go through each of the typologies, or how do you want to attack it?
Yeah, I think the first three especially, and I think The 4, 5, and 6 can kind of follow logically. We don't have to
Okay.
talk too much about those. But the first one is where freedom is affirmed, but equality and community are negated. And this is, he associates with libertarianism. So you have the maximal freedom, but you negate equality, so you allow hierarchies, for instance, to exist. And you negate community, usually in libertarianism, in the form of radical individualism, right? You're free, but only as an
Right.
individual, and so you're radically different from everybody else, and you have radically different interests from everybody else. So obviously, the idea of like unfettered market economies, um, the idea of equality of opportunity as being the only sense in which equality matters, right?
Mm.
That means equality is subsumed underneath freedom, right? That's the sort of reactive negation of equality, equality of opportunity. And then you could also negate it obscurely, which is like I thought this was really prescient for like our current time. The idea of obscurely negating community and equality for the sake of freedom. So when you obscurely negate one of the axioms, it means you think that the other axioms that you're negating are a threat to the main one you're affirming.
Right.
And this seems like sort of the difference between the kind of the classical liberal notion and sort of maybe the more conservative interpretation of classical liberalism today through things like the massive xenophobia and um, uh, sort of people that want to stop immigration, the Tea Party, Republicanism, and stuff like that, and seeing forms of community and equality as actually threats to freedom. So the
Right.
idea that you could have a social safety net that's a threat to your freedom
Mm.
because you want to have choice of the doctors you go to rather than the government deciding for you. That's obviously usually put forth as a bad faith argument, but it's a form of, so some people really do believe that, right? And so they believe that because they see community and equality as a threat to freedom.
What I really like is the way that he makes the distinction between what he calls the three political subjectivities, where it's the faithful subject, the reactive subject, and the obscure subject. And the faithful subject is the one who just radically stays committed or affirms the maximality, let's say, the maximal appearance of the axiom, right? Whereas the reactive one is like you talked about, there's a negation to it. It's a sort of, it's not an active suppression or violence towards it, but it's a sort of way of subsuming that under the dominance of the other axiom that they do affirm. And the obscurantist orientation of political subjectivity is the one that is fascist for Prozorov. And I thought that was really interesting because people today are throwing this term around, fascism, so loosely that I think it's lost a lot of meaning. And I was thinking, I'd like to write an article once or maybe if I ever have time here in the next year, about Jordan Peterson that's called No, Jordan Peterson isn't a fascist, but he is fascist. And what I mean by that is that the sort of logic or the disposition that characterizes his orientation is a fascistic logic in the sense that Prozorov here is articulating, that it is an intentional, violent assault to obscure other elements, other of the sort of elements within this political axiom, especially equality, and I would say even community. He's definitely towards equality. He just rails against equality of outcome and shit like that. And for him, equality is something that he just is only existable as equality of opportunity. And it's this idea of individual freedom that he wants to stimulate more than anything. And I think even community, he might, I don't know if he would obscure it or if he would negate it, but regardless, there is a fascistic element that would be interesting to explore from the basis within this logical paradigm that Prozorov sets up that I think really maps on well to something we've talked about here with regards to like Zizek and Lacan and the difference between the hysteric and the obsessive. The hysteric is the one that at least attests to the reality of disruption or the reality of the contradictions at the heart of being or the heart of life. Even though their actions may not be quote unquote true, they are based on their a symptomatic expression that is rooted in the truth of acknowledging or affirming, let's say, the axiomatic nature of reality. Whereas the obsessive does the inverse of that. They may live in a world that is based on a pursuit of truth, but it's only rooted in the active suppression of the truth of the situation as such, which is precisely what we would say, I think, from our perspective, what Jordan Peterson is doing is that he's suppressing the real contradictions of neoliberal capitalism, or he's suppressing certain truths at the more foundational level actively and willingly, which is what Zizek would argue is a way to understand fascism at the level of logic. Not that I'm not saying that Peterson is like fucking Mussolini or Hitler incarnate. Of course not. But there's a commonality at the ideological level, at the logical level, or at the level of their disposition of how they orient themselves to the world of politics and society that is what we might call a fascistic logic. And I think Prozorov here really helps give some tools to be able to flesh that out even further.
Yeah, I think that's really good. That's like the difference between fascistic actions following from fascistic ideology and just a
Right,
fascistic logic or ideology itself, right?
right.
And so the actions don't have to follow, but if the actions exist, they follow from the ideology, right? Yeah, it actually reminds me also of kind of a sort of Kantian perspective on how you follow or don't follow moral principles. So Kant talks
Mm,
about how if you have a moral principle, it's kind of three ways you can react to it. One is by actually following it, right, which is like the morally good way
mhm,
of doing things. Like I say, you have the principles to give to charity or to give to others, right? You might just give to charity because you know it's right. That's the good way to do it. You might not follow it though in two different ways. You might not follow it because you mix up your maxims. So like
mm,
you might say, "Man, I really need this money for myself because I have to like take care of my family and I need to get food for myself. And if I'm not happy by going to like movies and having nights out, then I'm going to be a bad person to live with. So I got to do this, right? It's like
mm,
self love, but a good kind of self love, like keeping myself going, kind of thing. But then
mm,
that becomes your reason for not giving to others, right? So you're doing things for a good reason, but not for the best reason, or sort of taking the best reason and making it subservient to some lesser reason. Or
mm,
you could also just be straight up wicked, which is you know what the moral principle is and you don't do it because you just don't do it straight
mm.
up.
Yeah.
And so that kind
Yeah,
of
that's
reminds
good.
me of the individual level of thinking about how what Prosrov is saying is happening more at the large scale level.
Yeah, that's the difference between the reactive and the obscure political subjectivity. Yeah, the obscure is the greed is good Wall Street asshole who's like, fuck these people. I am all about me actively. I'm gonna kick your fucking dog on the way to my office because I don't even give a shit about puppies. Like that would be like the sort of
Yeah.
maximal douchebaggery of just simply seeking individual freedom.
Yeah, and the reactive is Bill Gates, right?
Mm.
Which is like he's not saying fuck everyone else. In fact, he even gives a lot of money to his own charity. But
Mhm.
the conditions that enable that, and certainly he's not going to do anything which stops the conditions which enable that in the first place. Him to have all the money in which he can decide what to do with. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, that's more like the more complex reactive subject where yes, we're going to give money to charity, but only if it doesn't challenge the ultimate freedom that I have, which is greater than everybody else,
Mm.
right? Because I'm a
Yeah.
privileged individual with all this money.
Right. Okay, so that's libertarianism. So let's go on to the second one, egalitarianism. So obviously, egalitarianism is the negation of freedom, the maximization of equality, and the negation of community. So, and remember, he's using these terms, libertarianism, egalitarianism, and communitarianism, in ways that he says aren't the way that we would typically want to think about them because he wants to get to the sort of logical core that is expressed in these homonyms. He keeps using this idea of we talked about it a couple in the episode before, the
Homonymal.
homonymal relation, let's say, between the words that he's using here, libertarianism, egalitarianism, communitarianism, and then the way that we tend to understand them in everyday vernacular. And so egalitarianism here means something a little bit more precise. It is the negation of the two axioms and the affirmation of equality.
Yeah, so the obvious example here is like straight up historical materialism, right? Historical materialism says history has to move in a certain direction. And in the socialist form, that's right, the move from capitalism to socialism to communism. And that negates the freedom that things could be different. Things
Mm,
don't have to go in a specific direction. and of course being materialistic, it also, in a weird way, it says we're all in common, right? Because we're all just atoms in motion, right? But sort of negates the community by like not making that commonality mean anything
Mm, yeah.
in a
Yeah,
sense.
he
I
talked
had a hard time
yeah.
kind of putting that into words.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, this kind of fits into what we said at the outset that the negation of one necessarily leads to the dissolution of the others. And so the negation of freedom also means that we're not sharing freedom in common, right? That there isn't a sense of community where people are freely sharing in common with one another their own freedom. Matter of fact, the only thing that's inexistent is a sort of imposition of equality in what he talks about the experience of real socialism of the Soviet type that's emulated to different degrees by Soviet satellite states and autonomous socialist states from China to Albania. And he's this might seem like an overgeneralization, but he actually gets into sort of these more complex, let's say, variations of these combinations where he says, well, during the years of this 1938 to or 1936 to 1938, you have like these nuanced expressions of this type of political typology. So it isn't just simply socialism, historical materialism is evil, and uh, Bill Gates is a fascist, and whatever the communitarian example is, yeah, they're fascists either. He really is working through nuanced ways of trying to articulate not only well, I guess to articulate different combinations, let's say, of these typologies. So I think that's important. So like one of the examples he uses right here, he says, so if both the axiom of freedom and community are reactively denied, which is that that's not the active like fascistic way, but it's just the sort of, hey, equality is the most important, but freedom and community, we're going to try to negate them as much as possible. They might exist because, you exist in a world where these certain expressions are there, like people are going to want to do their own thing. That would be an expression of freedom. But the socialist project, at least in a very simple sense, post Civil War in the USSR, prior to what he calls the Stalinist Great Break, he says socialism was thought along precisely these lines as an egalitarian project undertaken by the party state in a top down manner through the disqualification of pre revolutionary class hierarchies, the negation of freedom through censorship, and of community through the elimination of all autonomous associations were shrugged off as the inconsequential abolition of useless formal freedoms and petty particularistic communities that was more than compensated for by the rise of the new egalitarian society. So, in other words, after the Civil War, you've got this push towards radical egalitarianism or radical equality. But in the process, what became less important for the party at that point was stimulating freedom. One of the ways that they did that was through censorship. Another way that they did that was by basically just saying that these freedoms are bourgeois. These freedoms are capitalist. They are remnants of the system that we have overcome. We do not need them because the party will be your freedom. The party in building state socialism is now what matters as freedom. The party as the emblem of equality is now your freedom. So that was problematic for him. And then the way that it negates community, the way that this particular historical unfolding of state socialism negated community was through the elimination of the autonomous associations, which could be more like autonomous workerist movements, various other, let's say, para-Soviet party institutions that would seek to challenge the party dominance that came to take over as the central hegemonic power in state socialism. And so negating the ability of people to form those communities by saying no, you don't need any of that. We've got all of that through the Soviet party as the egalitarian society as such. By doing that, that's the reactive way that post Civil War USSR was maximizing equality but reactively negating freedom and community.
Yeah, whenever you reactively negate community or even obscurely negate community, you can see it because divisions are made. exclusions are made between people, right?
Mm,
So you have this like ultimate everything that's this artistic movements and these autonomous associations are inherently bourgeois and capitalistic without actually
right.
making a case that they're actually bad. For what reason are they bad other than their identity, so to speak? Well, then their identity is what's bad. Well, then you have an
Mm,
exclusion in community
mm,
automatically if the
yeah.
identity is inherently other than us. So that's the key when you see that community is being negated.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then of course he says there's a hyperbolic example of this at the level of the obscure, which is the more fascistic expression of egalitarianism, which he talks about with the Stalinist labor camps of the gulags. He says they're hyperbolic examples of this, what he calls a terrorist egalitarianism. They equalize the beings of the world solely as, according to Agamben, this term, it's called homina sacri, which is basically beings that are exposed to death that is neither homicidal nor sacrificial because they're subject to the whims of the totalitarian state that can exist at that level of indecidability. It can determine who is in and who is out based on its own sort of self legitimizing authoritarianism. So that would be the fascistic expression of egalitarianism. All that matters is equality at the end of the barrel of a gun. That's what equality is in the fascistic sense. So that's the really bad egalitarianism, according to Prozorov.
Yeah, I really appreciated this sort of formal critique of quote unquote real socialism, which is not. People oftentimes are kind of afraid to, people on the left at least, are afraid to critique the Soviet Union for those reasons. Oftentimes for with good motives, right? Because anything you say against the Soviet Union, you have to have the context of the Cold War and the capitalist West trying to snuff it out, and and everything
Right.
else, right? That's acting against them. And so all that context should be admitted, but also at the same time saying fucking gulags are bad. You know, like
Right.
that's not an
Yeah.
extreme thing. That should be, if that's not like a first principle, then there's a problem.
Yeah, I feel like he's really sort of helping us navigate between potential criticisms from both like right wing and left wing. Or what he's doing is he's giving us ways to engage with both right wing and left wing ways of looking at like let's say the Soviet Union for example. Because on the right it's socialism is totalitarianism where he's kind of like, well, through certain phases, more or less, it expressed more of this totalitarian, dictatorial tendency. And then through other phases, it was a little bit less than that. And it was based on the variation of these political axioms in how much they were expressed or negated. And I think that's kind of really, it's actually really nice to help us with a nuanced approach to be able to understand how it is that you can have something with such a sort of complex history where people on one side, like you said, are afraid to criticize it, and then people on the other side that can only criticize it. And he's kind of showing you why both of those positions are actually where they fail, and how they can be supplemented.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to say, hey, look, these three big paradigms, right? Libertarianism as following from the liberal tradition, egalitarianism following from the socialistic tradition, and communitarianism following from several different traditions. But they can all end really terribly, right?
Mm,
Communitarianism can end up as European fascism. Egalitarianism can end up as the Soviet Union in the gulags. And libertarianism can end up with what we're kind of seeing the West go towards right now, which is like massive xenophobia and incredible inequality.
mm, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So the last one he talks about, let's just do it real quickly, is communitarianism. And this is where you negate freedom, negate equality, but you maximize community. Now, this one, he doesn't really have an historical example that he gives for it, does it? This is the one, well, he kind of does. He says that it existed in like sort of post Soviet states in Central Asia, which supplanted the discredited communist ideology with a traditionalist mode of legitimation of repressive and highly inegalitarian regimes. So there are certain like this is part of the what would you call it, like peripheral Soviet states or post-Soviet states. So in it's just like basic, not when it's like obscure or reactionary sense. It it kind of still fits into the logic of like real existing socialism. It's just different from the egalitarianism because this one doesn't necessarily require any sort of imposed egalitarianism. There can be hierarchies, there can be stifling of freedom, but it's all supposedly in the pursuit of the community. And that can be the problematic expression, because it's just simply about community at that point, with no emphasis on equality or freedom to kind of round out its possibility for being political.
Yeah, I actually thought he doesn't mention it much at all here, but I thought sort of religious communities, pre-Enlightenment for the most part, were a
Ah.
good example of this because you think of like Calvin's
Mm,
Geneva. Calvin's Geneva was this, right? It was absolutely community above all else. We are all in this together for one common goal and purpose, right? To live God's chosen kingdom. And so there's going to be
mm,
massive hierarchy and massive suppression of freedom, but it's for a greater good. It's for the community. And you hear this a lot in the logic of kind of conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists today, right?
mm,
Yes, men and women are technically unequal, but it's a complementarian relationship,
mm,
they'll say, right? And that's they complement each other. So they're equal in the sense that they're all equal in the community, right? But the community dictates what equality is.
yeah,
So if the
equal but different.
community, yeah,
Equal before the law, or something along those lines.
or equal before God in the religious
Equal
sense,
before
right?
God,
Which is,
right?
yeah, men and women are equal before God, but in practice, women have to do certain things and men can kind of have free choice in a lot of ways. So it's sort of a formal equality, but only according to what the community dictates and not a substantive equality. So I thought of that. And
Mm,
also, I mean, we both grew up in and out of evangelical circles. The church community in evangelicalism is kind of like this too, right? There's obviously strict hierarchy that you have to follow, and
mhm,
definitely suppression of freedom, right? You're definitely not allowed to air your own personal beliefs or opinions, or especially your doubts. You have to follow the line, and there's an obvious restriction on the actions you can do, even if those actions don't actually like hurt
hmm.
anybody or cause any harm. And but it's all in the service of the community's goals, right? The community has a specific goal to reach, and you have to play your part to get there.
Hmm. I think that's excellent. Yeah, and that would be, I mean, to varying degrees, that would be probably more commonly reactionary or reactive, but sometimes it would verge into the sort of fascistic, obscure negation of those things too, which you would probably get in more sort of, let's say, like fundamentalist Latter Day Saints, or like certain Jim Jones cults or something like that. Maybe those would be the sort of fascistic expression of a communitarian political typology.
Or anybody who is a good faith Christian and who argues that, um, for instance, immigrants don't have the same sort of rights before God or same status before God as Christians or Americans do. We're
Mm,
probably going to talk about an article that is about this exact issue in the next couple of weeks. But that idea sounds kind of foreign to some people because they're like, well, I mean, wasn't Jesus' message about love for all and love your neighbor? Well, what if they say, well, yeah, but my neighbor isn't this person,
right.
right?
Yeah, see this, and this is what's so interesting, because this is showing us that the negation of those other two elements of the sort of triad, the political axiomatic triad, it contaminates the one that supposedly is upheld, right? Because then, even at that point, community becomes just a shitty degradation of the idea of what community is. So yeah, it's a communitarian logic, it's a communitarian typology, but only in a very sort of degraded form. It's not any sort of community to aspire to, because it's a community that is rotten in its hatred or in its anger towards these other elements of the political axioms that are required.
Yeah, and you can absolutely see how in Prozorov's sort of typology here, it didn't have to be that way. Sort of evangelicalism, for our example that we're using, could have gone differently than it did if it had began affirming freedom and equality instead, or just reactively negated them. But the move towards obscurely negating them is pretty clearly happening in
Mm.
that social group, and you can use this typology to sort of make sense of that.
Yeah, and there are Christian communities that do try to stimulate more of these other elements within the triad, right? So Anabaptist communities, for example, would try to stimulate equality more and freedom more. They're working through that. They may not always do it well, and there's John Howard Yoder might have a sketchy history with regards to some of his actions, but um, this is kind of the point that Prozorov is getting at, is that this isn't some sort of that this is a process that you can, there's a flux and a flow and a give and a take, and there will be historical moments when certain elements of the triad are of the axiomatic triad are more maximal, and when they're more minimal, and yeah, but it's a useful tool by which we can sort of like look at the world and say, okay, so here's where this particular community is going wrong because, and this is how they've gone wrong and when they've gone wrong, because at this point in time they started to negate freedom, or they started to negate equality, or they started to negate community in favor of more affirming one of these other axioms. And then you can say, oh, but here's where we could maybe scale back and we can adjust this to maximize those areas that have been minimized up until now.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you a roadmap for
Yeah.
political practice. And so those are the big three, right? Libertarianism, egalitarianism, and communitarianism. And you also have the combinations. So you can have, for instance, egalitarian libertarianism. So you affirm freedom and equality, but you negate community. And he gives the example of sort of the welfare state post-war European social democracies as examples of
Right.
this, right? Because they affirm freedom, right? They're not going to fall down the real socialism, Soviet state socialism angle, and they affirm the equality that is part of socialism, right? But then they negate the community aspect of it, and that's
Right.
probably. And he gives examples of like trying to extinguish left-wing radicalism in the '60s and '70s, and I think even today you could look at the migration crisis in some of the social democracies in Europe
Mm.
and see the sort of the exclusionary anti-communitarian focus that's happening here, right? But yeah, we have welfare state liberalism, right? But only for us, right? And there's a
Right.
strict boundary between who's included and who's excluded.
Right. Right.
And then you can have communitarian libertarianism, which is affirming freedom and community but negating equality. And I thought a good example of this, I kind of wanted your opinion on it, was like Hayekian anarcho-capitalism, right? Because
I
they
mean, it would be
affirm community, right? Because they want this like community of individuals who are executing their freedom. But
right.
then that if that results in radical inequality, that's totally fine.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because the idea of a spontaneous organization and shit like that that will just automatically occur through the dictates of the market. See, I think that that's still more, it's still more libertarianism, because even community only matters, or at least how he's defining libertarianism, because community only matters insofar, or equality only matters insofar as it could be a byproduct of the machinations of the market. But yeah,
You mean
yeah, yeah, yeah.
community only matters for freedom?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Whatever I said is wrong, and yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that community and equality, both of them, only of them, would ever matter. This is why I think it's libertarianism, not what does they call it, communal libertarianism or libertarian
Yeah.
communitarianism, or whatever the fuck it is.
I think like
Um,
the ANCAPs believe that though, right? Like they're not just capitalists, they're anarcho-capitalists. They think that like the ideal social formation is goes hand in hand with absolute individual freedom. Maybe that
I g-
never actually exists, but I feel like they believe that. And that's different than
yeah.
people than like the market economy people.
Yeah, I guess it depends too. I mean, the more Hayekian version might be more kind of what you're talking about, but I'm thinking more like the Mises, the hardcore Mises and Cap guys are like, fuck all that other shit, man. It's just about market freedom, dude, and all the other stuff will fall into place because of, spontaneous organization is what they often talk about. So it's all about freedom through market transactions, because that will lead to an idea of potential ideas of community, because then everyone's in a free communal exchange. But
Okay, yeah,
it's
that makes
all
sense.
but it's all conditioned by freedom.
By
So
freedom, yeah.
that's like, yeah, it's a reactive negation of community, but by saying that somehow on the back end it might come about at some point.
So maybe like anarcho-primitivism is probably the better
Yeah,
like type here.
yeah, 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 exactly.
And they definitely think community is to be prized um, along with freedom.
100%. Right.
Yeah, and so then the last one, then before the ideal one, is the egalitarian communitarianism. So this is where you negate freedom, but you affirm equality and community. And the example that he gives is like post-Bolshevik Soviet society before you had the sort of dissolution of the communitarian ethos. I actually
Mm,
thought I wanted your opinion on this. I wrote down like Catholic social teaching and the social gospel as examples of this.
mm,
So, in the sense that um, sort of freedom is negated, right? In the classic, like you don't there is such things as sin and righteousness, right? And you're a sinner and you need forgiveness and yada yada, right? And change your ways. But then it's also like the goal of helping the community, of building,
Mm.
and everyone's part of this, and you can't just exclude people, and everyone's equal before God and stuff. And so you should desire to build a society where there's welfare for everyone.
I have a feeling, and I don't know if this is how true this is, but I have a feeling that this is about as political, according to Prozorov's terms. This is about as political as the Christian church can ever be. The communitarian, egalitarian politics. I think that if you are ultimately going to subsume yourself, at least in the Orthodox sense, if you're like some sort of heterodox Christian, like
Death of
social
God theologian.
justice, death of God theologian, yeah, exactly. Then I think you could affirm all three axioms. But I think if you are within the Orthodox tradition, this is about as 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 political as you can be, or as affirming of the axioms as you can be, because I think that there's always that level of transcendence that's going to treat your communitarian and egalitarian relations as means to an end, right? This
There's
would be
not
like the
pure
Nietzschean,
contingency,
right?
right? If
Exactly,
capital G God exists, you can't have ultimate absolute contingency, and so freedom
exactly,
has to be negated.
yeah. Which, here's the thing, man. This is better than fascistic egalitarianism. It's better than fascistic libertarianism. Like,
Yeah,
this is what I
I'd
kind of
rather have the this one than any of the other five,
yeah, dude,
personally.
for sure, man. Like, this is not awful. See, it reminds me a lot of you. He talks about post revolution Bolshevik community, and I'm thinking about, like, with regards to Sartre again. After the storming of the Bastille, where everyone has radical freedom because it's like this total contingency. You can do whatever the fuck you need to do. We just got to do something to respond right now to this external pressure. You have community because everyone is equal, egalitarian because everyone is equal in serving this common goal. But then once you do it, you're sitting there and you're like, okay, we've done it. You man the door and you go take a letter to this person, and then you become the letter taker. And then this person becomes the door monitor, and this person becomes the blacksmith or whatever. Once that happens, that's the introduction of stasis, which negates contingency. And that's the moment that he calls the organization, Sartre. And the organization for him is, I think, the point that maps onto communitarian, egalitarian politics here for Prozorov. It's contingency, freedom is negated a little bit. It's not like, how dare you ever think otherwise? It's not fascistic. It could be, but it's not necessarily that. But at the very least, it's the negation of the possibility that things could be radically other than they would be under, like, the pure expression of a free communitarian egalitarian world politics.
Yeah, and maybe I don't know Sartre enough, but you can maybe tell me that what Proskov is adding to that is that it's not just organization itself that introduces stasis and then the dissolution into not affirming any of the axioms. It's not just organization itself that introduces stasis, but it's when you have an organization that has this logic of security. Is what he calls it at the end of the book here, and he gives this parable where he talks about a group of people, kind of like the Puritans, who were oppressed in their own society, who left to find some new place where they could form their own community, and who honestly did want to affirm all three axioms.
Mm,
And they get there and they want to do it, and they find that there are some natives there. And the natives have some weird practices that are complex and unique. And so they have a choice now, these new people. We can continue to affirm all three axioms, which means not excluding the natives, even if their practices are different and sometimes not even just bad. Or we can set up our own thing and sort of exclude them from it. And so when we do
mm,
that, we then have to restrict people's freedom because if they want to include the natives, our own people want to include them by marrying them or befriending them or trading with them, we have to restrict people's freedom and then punish them for doing that if they keep doing it, so then they're unequal. So just
mm,
by making this exclusion in the sense of community, by excluding these native people, you then negate freedom and then equality.
mm,
And it happens over a longer period than just that, right? But
sure.
it's not just organizing, but it's organizing and then making this choice to not affirm one of the axioms because you feel like we need the security of keeping somebody out.
Yeah.
And it
So
can
I mean,
happen in many different ways, but that's one way.
Yeah, I mean, when Sartre uses the word "the organization," he's using it in a sort of precise technical sense in his book, in his unfolding of this argument that he is making. But the interesting thing is the logic actually works very similar to what Prozorov is here with regard to security. The reason that the organization for Sartre starts to hunker down and stifle, let's say, the radical expression of freedom is because of the threat from the other, the threat that the other will return, the threat that there's some sort of potential imminent foe that is always going to come in and disrupt their equal community. And then so what they do is they all swear an allegiance to each other that they will never go back to the way they were before. And at the same time, there becomes an internal threat of sedition or treason, right? This is what he calls fraternity terror. It's the terror that you look around outside of you and any one of you motherfuckers could be a traitor. And so it also then reintroduces the possibility of suspicion at the same time. So this need for security through like swearing an oath, which then solidifies what he calls the pledged group, which turns into the organization, is based on this similar need for security that Prozorov is discussing here as well.
Yeah, remember we were talking about last episode with Brett about some of our worries about accelerationism and the ideas of exclusion and secrecy,
Mm,
and stuff like that. I kind of feel like this is what I we were getting at a little bit with that, right? And that it's not
mm,
just about fetishizing openness and inclusion and those things. Like fetishizing things is stupid because it has no goal in mind, right? But this actually tells you that if you don't have inclusion and equality and freedom as the axioms of your political project, it's not just that, oh, it's not as beautiful anymore if you don't have
mm,
those things. No, actually, you set yourself on the slope that destines you towards dissolution of good political practice. So you
mm,
actually do sort of ruin your political practice when you have sort of necessary exclusions and domination of people's freedom and massive inequality and stuff like that. That makes a lot more sense to
mm.
me because it's not fetishizing those things. It's saying you're actually negating what's making the society good in the first place.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. So I guess let's wrap this up. The final point then is what he calls the politics of the world. And the politics of the world is the affirmation of all three axioms: freedom, equality, and community. And this is what he says. He says, the politics of the world may also be termed world politics. In contrast to intra worldly politics, which refers back to the particular transcendental of the world politics connotes that what is at stake in this politics is not the maintenance or modification of any aspect of the transcendental, but rather the worldhood of the world as such, the being of the world. In other words, the bursting forth of the void into any phenomenological, worldly, intra-worldly experience. That's what world politics is. So then he says, all forms of politics except for world politics, except for freedom, equality, and community. All other forms of politics presuppose the world as already pre constituted and delimited in its positivity, even when they venture to transform this positivity through the affirmation of one or two axioms. Only world politics, which negates none of the axioms and therefore does not institute any transcendental order, politicizes and thus relativizes the very existence of the entire world in which it is affirmed. World politics is the politics that, by affirming all three axioms of the world, puts in question the whole world in which it is applied. And this is kind of the point that Troy keeps going back to. In other words, everyday experience, everyday worlds that we move through, they are completely, entirely contingent. And world politics is one, the recognition and affirmation that those worlds are contingent, and two, the recognition that that means they could be other, and three, perhaps the most important point, therefore we can make them other according to these three axioms of freedom, equality, and community, insofar as we can maximize them as possible. Every other political order, no matter what it is, doesn't matter who or how it might be, if it doesn't affirm all three of those axioms, it presupposes that the world somehow, as it's pre-constituted or delineated in its expression, is somehow necessary, that it's somehow that way on purpose, but it's not. And he's saying that we need to negate that tendency to negate the three axioms, and therefore engage in a process of affirming the three axioms of freedom, equality, and community in their maximal expression.
Mwah. That was perfect. That kind of gets to the main point that gets to at the end of the chapter here, and that's that nihilism doesn't really stay true to its word in a sense, or modern nihilism doesn't really stay true to its word, in the sense that he wants to say that nihilism actually, the bad kind of nihilism, actually kind of the result of when you negate one of these axioms and you unwind the political order to eventually negating all three of them.
Hmm.
Right, that's sort of the bad outcome, right?
Right.
And so any attempt to make the current order, which does not affirm all three axioms, necessary, is actually covering over nihilism, right? It's kind of pretending, rather than actually sort of affirming nihilism in some sense, it's covering over the true nihilism, right? In the sense of it's not admitting that we're going to end up devolving into that negation of the three axioms. And it's also covering over the kind of void as world stuff that Prozorov's talking about.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like he's introducing two poles here, right? And saying, if we admit that there's these two poles in a sense, and a whole bunch of stuff in between the two poles in the spectrum, then we have a way of figuring out how to move towards one or the other, and hopefully towards the world politics side.
Hmm.
And any attempt to negate the axioms almost has to deny that paradigm in the first place.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I find this project really fascinating. I was in a reading group yesterday actually talking about Henri Lefebvre's book, The Production of Space, in which he's trying to talk about this concept of space and how do we understand what space, not outer space, like Space Force, not that kind of space, but the concept of spatiality and how do we understand it and how do we conceive of it, not just in terms of in the Kantian sense that it's some sort of transcendental condition in our mind, and not in some crude scientistic sense where, oh, it's just some objective thing out there in the world that we are in, but rather we need to understand space as a site of social production. And he wants to examine this from within an anti-capitalist frame, of course. And so he has a way of doing this. But I found some of the questions that he was asking, and actually, I think this book is going to be really interesting. We just finished chapter 1 in this reading group that we're doing, but I almost found Prozorov's text serving as a litmus test for so much of how he was engaging in the discussion, and then what he was proposing, even though it's only like 70 pages in, what he was proposing that his program would be. I was kind of like, I wonder if I can use Prozorov, and maybe in areas where I question Prozorov, I can use at least Badiou, who I have an affinity for, and even like the sort of Heideggerian distinction between ontology and the ontic, or this idea of the nothing, and nihilism as being the negation of das Nicht, the nothingness per se. And if I can use that as an interesting sort of like benchmark, it's like a measuring stick by which I can look at these other texts and I can say, but he's not asking this question appropriately because he's presuming the phenomenological without considering the ontological, or something like that. Now that presumes, of course, that we buy Prozorov's project, but I think if we do, it does that really well. It serves as that litmus test really well when analyzing these other political endeavors, or social endeavors, or philosophical endeavors. And so I think it's got some legs, man, as a theoretical work.
Yeah, I think that's its real potential, right? It's a
Mm.
diagnostic tool because you can use it as a tool with which to analyze both historical and modern trends.
Mm.
And, I kind of thought that some of the discussion of the Soviet Union and the United States as examples of some of these political invariants was not always, maybe it was helpful in terms of understanding the content, and I'm sure that was the point. But there's always holes and there's always misconceptions and things that don't really fit, anomalies and whatnot.
Mm.
But you can then, it's more, I think, a way to look towards how to act in the present,
Yeah.
right? To see what kind of political and social actions in practice are going to be effective and which are not.
Mm.
'Cause that's the most confusing thing, right? I mean, do we just do what historical movements that have succeeded have done?
Mm.
I mean, sometimes things are different, right? You just look at, for instance, the how sort of mass protest, and many times in the past, most mass protest has been incredibly effective. Then you look at 2003 and the Iraq War, and it's incredibly ineffective. In fact, actually was co-opted by supporters and by President Bush and the supporters of the Iraq War as sort of an affirmation of the sort of positive qualities of American democracy.
Mm.
And so maybe you have to rethink, well, does protest not work anymore? And I'm not sure. But this gives you a bit of a tool to say, well, we can analyze our current situation with these three axioms, see what's being negated and how,
Right.
and then look towards how to affirm it.
Yeah, you can always say it works insofar as it is or is not affirming these axioms. And that's what's really helpful. I was thinking about this with regards to, and this will be kind of, I guess, my last thought with regards to the accelerationist manifesto that we chatted about with Brett last week, when we were kind of caught up in like, oh, what is this neoliberal material that Nick and Alex were thinking that we can speak or that we can build from, that we can sort of build on top of. And I was thinking the neoliberal material are precisely the intraworldly phenomenological transcendental indexes that are effects of either varying degrees of negation or affirmation or obscuring the axioms. And the idea is the way that we can transform them is by maximally affirming the void that is the world that is there, but that is maybe being negated or obscured. And that's how we do it. Is and I know that's kind of abstract and theoretical. So what does that mean? It's how do we affirm freedom? How do we affirm equality? And how do we affirm community from within the neoliberal techno dominated world that currently exists? So you talked about medical devices and things like that. And, we could say, okay, well, patents restrict the freedom of innovation of, maybe some kid in rural Nebraska who is like this fucking genius who has this idea, but since he doesn't have access to the scientific articles or to the medical devices, he or she is not able to build out on this potentially fucking amazing idea because of the threat of a lawsuit or something like that. So that's a restriction of freedom. So let's not do that and let's maximize freedom. But then that's not enough because we also have to make sure that we're ensuring equality and community at the same time. So there are always it's almost like a checks and balances. I know that word is loaded in the context of American democracy. But there's this nice way of saying, okay, here's how we can build out on that project of transforming this sort of present material conditions for more fully realized world political means. And world political means the complete affirmation of that triad of those axioms. And I was like, cool. Again, I wish we would have read this fucking before we talked with Brett, or at least that it would have been fresher in my mind or something like that, because I think he would have liked that. So, but it's kind of good now as a supplement to kind of think back to that discussion,
Yeah, I mean, if you define material conditions as being that broad, I'm all on board with that, right? I mean, we've talked about this before, but ideas are material.
Right?
So in that sense, if we're going to make material defined that broadly, then yeah, I'm all about that. I wonder if that's how accelerationism would view it, but
That's how my
if it is, then
accelerationism would
yeah.
view it.
We have to come up with our term for materialistic idealism or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, can we do a manifesto? Did you see the thing that I tweeted about? I tweeted out about the shipping ship.
I'm not sure.
Hold on, you gotta go to my Twitter real quick, and I'll show you. You'll see what I'm talking about. There's a picture of a ship, but it's like a ship that's shipping ships, but it's not just shipping ships; it's shipping ships. And so the thing is, like how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? It was like
Yeah.
how many shipping ships could a shipping ship if a shipping ship could ship shipping ships?
I don't
Or
think you're saying that right.
I
Oh,
am.
okay, I see it. Oh,
I'm
so they're shipping ships that are being shipped.
Yeah, but then it's not just. But look at the bottom row. It's not just shipping ships. It's ship. It's shipping ships.
This is quality podcast material right now.
Yeah, just go check it out. But my point is what would our manifesto be if it's like the materialist, idealist, accelerationist manifesto? Is that what this
But
would be? We'd have to come
you're
up with
saying
our
it
own.
should be materialism?
Yeah, the materialist idealism manifesto.
It's like the first time I heard metamodernism, yeah, metamodernism or postmodernism, and I almost threw up.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So, final thought.
You threw me up with the shipping thing. I don't even remember what we're talking about.
Yeah, transforming the material conditions and shit like
Oh
that.
yeah.
But no, just final thought on Prozorov's text. What do you think?
This has been it's a great book. I really enjoyed it, as difficult as it was and as dense as it was. It was incredibly rewarding to read and to think about. Um, I would encourage anybody who's listened to these episodes but hasn't read the book to give it a try, even if you just get through parts of it. I think it will be rewarding.
Mm.
Um, and it's been rewarding for me also to talk about this a lot.
Yeah.
Just being able to make connections, get ideas from you. Feels a bit like college, man.
I mean, that's what this podcast is all about, right? Just never letting go of Mandarin Wong and us eating egg drop soup and the orange chicken. And what was our homie's name that used to always hook us up?
Oh, Ming.
Ming. Oh, gosh. Good days, brother.
We should do a Patreon where we all go to MDub.
I'm so down. Meet us in Santa Clarita at Mandarin Wong, or Newhall, I guess it is. Yeah, I agree. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's really nice to take a book like this at this pace. We have so many time demands imposed upon us, especially if you're in the academic world, but even if you're not, that you have to read or you have to consume at a certain tempo. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'd love to engage more in the practice of slowing down. And I don't just mean that in the sense of like disconnecting and, the sort of hippie mantra. What was it? Like drop out, something, something, tune out, drop out, tune in, drop out, whatever.
Drop dead.
What yeah, I don't whatever the fuck it was. I'm not talking about it like in that sense, but more in the being able to have time to really reflect. The Roman philosophers called it otium. It was the idea of having that time to yourself where you could reflect on yourself and you could journal and think about yourself. And it doesn't have to be like you're actually sitting there like, what did I do wrong today? Like Augustine's Confessions or something like that. But just taking the time to really let shit percolate, without then reading 10 different texts and then not being able to really let them sit. And it was really nice to take it at that pace. So I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as well. And like I said, I think that I probably won't even have more fully fleshed thoughts on the usefulness of the text for a little bit of time as I'm trying to use it as that benchmark or as that litmus test or the diagnostic tool, as you called it. So, but I really dug it. So, yeah.
Man, you're gonna like my sticky leaves.
Oh, I always like your sticky leaves. That's the point of it. Before we get into that, I do want to say that we're going to be recording a bonus episode talking about some questions that we have about this book. So if you enjoyed this discussion and you want access to the bonus episode, make sure you sign up at Patreon, and and we'll be uploading that actually by the time that this episode is out, that one will actually probably be out as well. We'll release them sort of in tandem with one another. Okay, sweet. So let's go into our sticky leaves this week. This is the section of the cast where one of us gets to talk about what it is that is giving us meaning in a world that is often devoid of meaning. Troy, it is your turn to share the goods. What's up?
So you kind of preempted me a little bit with your talk about time for reflection and journaling and whatnot, right?
Oh, that's why you had that smile on your face.
Yeah, well, that's just because I'm looking at you, bro.
Oh.
I wanted to call this Sticky Leaves in praise of downtime. And that's because I've been thinking a lot lately about just being super busy and super stressed out by deadlines and things being due and whatnot. And constantly, even when you're reading philosophical texts and other books that you are doing for career aspirations and whatnot, you kind of feel like you're reading them just for knowledge accumulation, like it's developing human capital, in a sense. And so, both reading this Prozorov book for the podcast and also just some other things I've been thinking about recently, there's really something to be said for making time and space where you just can't do anything else. Because
Mm,
I find that even if I have free time, I end up feeling guilty if I'm not using it, and so I end up using it for doing other things that are sort of extending the time that I'm doing things that I have to do anyway, or
mm,
um, working on other projects or whatever it is, right? And so just having time where you can't do anything else and you're not bothered by the internet or um, probably other people too, just to have some individual downtime.
mm,
Like if you're on the train and you just can't go anywhere, or on the bus and you can't go anywhere, or you're walking. And so you're doing something, but there's not a whole lot you can be distracted by. Those are all absolutely necessary, I think, for developing creative thinking and also kind of forming your thoughts together once you've done your creative thinking.
mm.
And those are both aspects of thought that are so important to philosophy, right? Because yeah, you have to think creatively to, sort of get out of the morass of ideas of the past. But then you also can't just think creatively. You have to form your thoughts and to make sense and to have logic to them. And that takes a lot of unconscious work and a lot of conscious work. And so you have to give your mind space to do those things. And I think we just don't have that much anymore. We don't make time for that because we think it's a waste
Mm.
for some reason. And even, for a lot of people that aren't, professional philosophers or don't, are kind of novices in the area, maybe that downtime just ends up with like that like bro philosophy. Like,
Mm.
do other people see the same colors as I do? Like, whoa. Or like Zeno's paradoxes, right? Like, is motion really real if you can only go halfway each time? Like, even if it ends up with the Keanu voice doing those things, that's still important, right?
Mm.
Like, everybody had to do that. The philosophy bro stuff is funny because that's how everybody started, with something like that, something kind of ridiculous that everyone thinks of. But it blows your mind a little bit because you never thought about it,
Mm.
and you don't think about that stuff unless you have this downtime to just make free connections that have no actual practical value in the moment. So I'm encouraging everybody out there to find some space a couple times a week, put yourself somewhere where you can't do anything else but think and won't be all freaked out and anxious about it.
Ew, yeah. I can
Take a bus
already
to nowhere.
I can see people or I can feel other people when as soon as you say that going like, you know?
I know, right? Yeah, the 24/7 economy is just so antithetical to that.
Yeah, because people might be like, "Oh, but dude, I meditate and I go to yoga and I spend time reading my novels and those things aren't bad in themselves." The question is well maybe let's use Prozorov's text. Is in what way are they expressing maximally the axioms of freedom, community, and equality? And if there's a sense in which you are experiencing a sort of, I don't know, imposition of demand so that you can keep up with the tempo of consumption, then that immediately right there stifles your freedom, right? And 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 I don't know if it works entirely because this isn't a political activity. This is more of a sort of, I don't know, a philosophical or spiritual or personal practice. But there is something to consider about. It's not that you're just saying meditation is good per se. It's or thinking is good per se or reading is good per se. It's that we have to understand under what conditions are those things taking place. Because like every tech company is cool with people meditating. In fact, they have like chief happiness officers who oversee meditative activities for lunch breaks and things like that. But the point is that you go in, you take your lunch break to meditate, or maybe even have your own personal private meditation hour or half hour that's not your lunch break. And you're like, oh, see, I have a whole, they respect me and they're totally cool. Right. But the idea is again, is this meditation isn't it's still there to make sure that you are a more efficient worker. It's still there to make sure that you aren't truly reflecting on, in the way that Troy is advocating, a sort of like radical connection or disruption with the world in which you live. Which, I mean, that's why fucking Socrates was killed, right? Because he was asking questions, disrupting, stirring shit up.
Yeah, exactly. Meditation's not necessarily always like neutral, right? It's directed towards specific ends. And there's all different kinds of meditation, right? But yeah, the kind that I'm talking about here is much more like the peripatetic stuff that the Aristotle and his students used to do. the walking and thinking, because you're occupied, your body's moving, you can't sort of be immediately distracted by engaging with tools around you. But it's kind of driving your mind towards making connections and towards reflection. And we can do that in other ways. You don't have to do it by walking, but that's I think an absolutely necessary thing for good thinking.
Hmm. Yeah, I dig it. You remember my MA supervisor, Philip Goodchild, right? I remember one of the things
Mhm.
he wrote a book on piety, and I remember one of the things that I thought was it was like so weird to me. But he was talking about how sometimes he like goes long periods where he just doesn't read. He just sits there with a pen and a pad of paper, and he just sits there like and goes for walks and just writes. And I was like, I remember thinking like, yeah, but you got to consume more information, man. There's only a limited amount of time, and I got to know everything. I got to read them all. It's fucking Pokemon. Got to catch them all. And I remember thinking at the time that it sounded very difficult to just sit there for hours in silence with just your pen and not even because I think of writing as like I've got resources and I've got ideas that I want to build on, and then you got to find a quote, and then you take that quote and you expand on it. But this was literally just him with a pad of paper and a pen and his thoughts. And it seemed like a very interesting, almost spiritual practice as a philosophical practice. So, and here's the thing is that people might be thinking, this is like for wanky philosophical people. But the point of philosophy isn't supposed to be some academic discipline. It's supposed to be a practice of life. It's a way of ordering your own self and your society by challenging the status quo, by thinking through ideas, by asking questions, by criticizing, by building, creating concepts, by figuring out strategies for how it is that we can create better lives or better worlds. Stuff like that. And that's something that everybody does, just maybe they're not getting paid for it. But fuck, universal basic income. Maybe everyone should get paid for this shit. I don't know.
Yeah, if you engage in creative thinking at all, which everybody does, or any kind of creation, then this is a process that's necessary towards any kind of flourishing or success. So
Hmm.
just don't do it to make someone else money.
Exact. Wait a second. Isn't that wait, how God damn it. How does that work? See, now I'm confused. Now we're gonna have to talk about something else at another time, because basically that's what professional academic philosophers do. We're
Yep,
stuck we're
burn the
stuck
system
in it.
down.
We're stuck in it, bro.
Let's all be hermits.
Ah.
All right, so that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed the book club. We are planning on doing more of these in the future, so look out for that. So, although it'll probably be a couple of weeks as we get some of the other ideas that we have into the podcast chamber. In the meantime, you can go to owlsatdawn.com if you want to download the episode or give comments on the episode we can respond to. We'd be happy to chat more about this book and any the forums we have available. You can also find us on Twitter at owls_at_dawn, or you can email us at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com.
iTunes, if you could leave us a 5-star rating and a review, that'll really help for boosting us up in the iTunes algorithm so other people can find the cast. We're gonna work on getting us out on other platforms too. I'm just crazy busy right now, but getting us up on like Deezer, Stitcher, or Spotify, so that Android users don't have to keep going to the website to stream or download. So we'll
I'm an
get
Android user and I can download our episodes.
yeah, but like it's more convenient maybe because if you have the Stitcher, Deezer, or Spotify app, no.
Remember when we saw those movies in like the 80s and 90s to depict the future, and like every single device was like really easy to use and universally like plugged into everything else?
Yeah,
Like how much dumb shit was that? Like the future's going to be having 60 million different gadgets that all overlap and that none of them connect to each other.
yeah.
And so you're constantly spending all day trying to figure out how to communicate one to the other. That's going to be the future.
Yeah, you're going to spend more time just figuring out how to communicate with other apps than you are actually going to be consuming or engaging with content. It's just going
Yeah,
to be like,
everyone becomes a part-time IT person.
yeah, it's exactly. It's everyone's a part IT bureaucratic manager, and that's the game. That's the game. It's not even the game is, can you problem solve how to actually get to the content that you want? You can earn
That's the
points
most
along the
dystopian.
way.
That's the most dystopian Black Mirror episode I've ever seen.
but you never actually get to it. But that's okay because you're earning points along the way, and it goes to your social credit rating system, and then you can buy better meals while you're
Buy
engaging
more
in other
apps.
buy more
create more
apps so you can
problems.
do better problem solving. Ah! Yeah, and then like I said, we're gonna be doing a bonus episode asking some further questions on this text. So if you want access to that and all the other bonus episodes and the monthly newsletter, which is going to be coming out this week because Troy and I just figured out how we're going to do it. So the first one's coming out this week, and then they're going to be monthly after that. And I think that is pretty much it.
Just one more thing, dude.
What's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.